more that we do beyond the prompt, the more we talk to the world's leading experts about AI, it dawns on me that the questions that we're trying to get answers to are not about technology, they're about human. AI is such a kind of like invasive technology. It's such a technology that you kind of like use as a partner, that a lot of the unknowns are questions of how do we define what we want out of it. And for us to be able to define it, we have to figure out what do we want out of it.
I got to be fun to get started. I don't know if everybody knows this, but I'm one of the privileged few who spent a lot of time working deeply with you both. And actually, strangely, especially to listeners of Beyond the Prompt, it's probably interesting to learn. It's weird to me that now Henrik and I spend more time together on Beyond the Prompt, because for a long time, Nick and I spent a lot more time together. There's a good stretch of time where Nick was more my primary collaborator and Henrik was a peripheral one. And then the market shift happened. All sorts of things happened. Here we are. So anyway,
I helped start Beyond the Prompt only for that reason. It was just to get Nick kind of like massaged out of the relationship.
It was part of your evil plan. I was a little surprised, I'll be honest. In my mind, when I know y'all are working on a book and when I see the title and things like this, like what jumps out at me most is AI. And I have to say, I was expecting an AI book, so to speak. I actually mentioned this to Henrik yesterday after we recorded a podcast episode. But what I got was not a book about AI. It's a book about me. And then probably secondarily, it's not a book about AI. It's a book about my customer. And then third, it's a book about AI. And so kudos to you, because I think there's a sense in which people are drawn to AI that actually it's a very reflective book. Do I get the emphasis right when I say it's actually not an AI book? It's a me book. And how do you react to that thought?
I think that is very true when you read it, and not. The more that we do beyond the prompt, the more we talk to the world's leading experts about AI, it dawns on me that the questions that we're trying to get answers to are not about technology, they're about human, right? Like it's all about AI is such a kind of like invasive technology. It's such a technology that you kind of like use as a partner, that a lot of the unknowns, I think, are questions of how do we define what we want out of it. And for us to be able to define it, we have to figure out what do we want out of it. Mm-hmm. And so I think in a roundabout way, it wasn't necessarily why we started that way, but as I reread the book now, I actually am happy about that, because I think if we had like written a lot of like, and here's how you prompt to kind of like understand your problem better, or here's how, like a lot of that would be dated like 2 seconds later. What I think AI does is that it allows us all now to be resourceful in a way that we were not resourceful before. It allows us to be entrepreneurs now at a period of time where I think having people who solve problems in a scalable way are much needed. And so I think you're right, it's not about AI, but I think those of us who spend a lot of time in the AI world are increasingly trying to figure out how do you create the dichotomy of humanity. And the more that we understand who do we want to serve and what is the problem that they have, then we can use AI throughout the whole process of building to make it easier to do so. Nick, did I speak out of turn there? Do you agree with that?
I think it's the nicest thing that anyone's ever said about the book, to suggest that it goes in the that it goes in order of the title, not that it's an AI buzzword thing. So that I'm mostly just reflecting on that. I had imagined it as, or there was a time when there was in the spirit of going from a collection of essays to something, there was a time where at least I had imagined that maybe it would live at the, that the book would kind of exist along the edges of the triangle, that you would have a section almost about you and your customer, and you'd have a section about your customer and AI, and you'd have a section about yourself and AI. And it was kind of along those, that those were the areas that at the intersections was where we might be able to kind of think and talk and do some work and advance the conversation. And so I think like that maybe it existed more at the nodes instead of the edges. I'm kind of thoughtful about, because maybe it just suggests the next bit of work. And in particular, I guess I would offer that I think we need to probably do more work on my customer to AI relationship. How much is the average end customer of any new entrepreneurial thing? What is their perception of AI? How much are they bombarded by it? How much do they use it? And how much do they even realize they're using it? Really, that really shapes a lot of all the rest of it anyway. And so, I don't know, that the thought process that I arrive at is like, do we need to do more work at where those different edges of the triangle are starting to interact more?
You could imagine a follow-up or an expanded edition. One thing that's striking me now, even as we talk, is what's not in this, sequence is two things: my employer or my boss. And what strikes me now, and we've got balloons for that realization. What strikes me about that, actually, which is quite interesting, I was having a conversation with a really good friend who's got a child in college who's studying computer science, which is like many families right now. And they're bemoaning the fact that internship opportunities are scarcer than ever. You can't find a job. And I found myself saying to this friend, one of my favorite expressions is, an inventor is never unemployed. And one might say an entrepreneur is never unemployed. And what I realize is, I think a lot of, especially young folks' paradigm is, the next thing I do is I get a boss. The next thing I do is I get a job. And I wonder if this is an opportunity to shift the paradigm. The next thing you do is get a customer. And what I told him was, hire yourself. You should tell your son, stop looking for a job and hire yourself. And I don't know if you've thought about, you call it the, niching down from the roughly 50% of people who say they want to start a business to the, people who actually do, or from 60 to 10. Well, what do you think about specifically young people and the moment that we're in, where the AI on the bottom of the page actually is ominous, is actually scary? How do you think about them?
I think it's the main why now of the book, that I think we're all, whether we have stats or data or just, anecdotal evidence to suggest that we think it's probably increasingly important that people come to grips with their own, like that. Going from the 60% who've had an idea to the 10% who do something about it, I think, making that leap used to be a nice to have. And I think even our own work in 2010 to 2020 period of like, I definitely don't feel like I did go into work every day. I thought it was fun. I thought it was like intellectually interesting. I thought it was potentially financially rewarding, but I don't think I thought it was like important for the world that we help more people start things, other than like that on the margin. I think that leads to people feeling fulfilled, and that's a good thing. But like, I think we're probably in a world, or heading to a world, where more people will be faced with the reality that this is their primary option. So I've certainly, I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying, but I feel that. And I think you see that. I think you see a lot of people who are un or underemployed, whether they realize it or not. I think that's true for very young people. I think that's true for people, coming into the middle of their career and realizing the opportunities are not quite what they thought they were. So I just think a lot of people are going to have to start going from the question of like, who's going to employ me to who's going to be my customer. Because I think the last job is maybe you can never be unemployed or whatever. That was a nice sentence that inventors are never unemployed. Well, Oxford are never unemployed. And we're heading to a world where like everyone's going to have to be not unemployed, or the thing is there. I also just will add one interesting little tidbit to the statistical reference and your point of like, be your own boss. You could easily, and actually the numbers I think are identical, substitute the 60% have had an idea for a business. And we actually debated this with 60% of people want to be their own boss. I think the data is like legitimately identical almost. And I'm not sure the Venn diagram is 100% overlapping. I think they might be different motivations. But I think the be your own boss thing, it fits a similar profile in terms of both like nice to have versus need to have, the way AI is shaping that, and how ominous or not AI is in the mix of shaping this kind of conversation.
I hadn't thought about it in the way that you phrased it, Jeremy, but I think that's very astute. The two things that I thought about in that space is increasingly I look at organizational design, and we obviously write about membrane organizations as a kind of like a new concept that kind of like goes all the way through customers, all the way to the supply chain. But if you look internally in our organization, increasingly the way that I compute it is that everything is a resource that you prompt that gives you an output. And that doesn't matter if that resource is a human one or is an AI one.
Right.
And I just expect to have somewhat like of a high output when I do a prompt.
Yeah.
And so if we are moving tactically towards a world where there is chief resource officers of companies and they are responsible for agents and humans, and the way that the organizational design and communication structure is organized is, basically like a computer system with APIs, inputs and outputs. I think that's one thing that would lead people to need to understand and work more entrepreneurial even when they have a boss. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is, Jeremy, as we talked about yesterday after our recording of the podcast, we had a whole podcast yesterday with the guy who runs the kind of strategy institute of BCG. And I mean, in the same way, it was an interview about AI, but it ended up being not about AI, because what we are asking people to do now that they have these Iron Man suit is to act like an entrepreneur when they have a job. It is to be more of a generalist. It is to have agency. It is to, understand what data they use, in the work. So suddenly, the job is less as part of a sausage factory, and it's more like a Navy SEAL that get deployed to solve a problem, or an entrepreneur that's trying to build a company. And so in that way, I think it's a very interesting point. It does not have a boss in the title, but that is because we're going to live in a world, I think, in our optic, that requires everybody to be more acting like an entrepreneur. And, with AI.
I don't know. I've just been reflecting even myself. I don't know if it's because of my upbringing. I grew up in the middle of the country, to parents who had very, call it, conventional jobs. Entrepreneurship wasn't on my radar as even a possibility until business school. And so I wonder, it's kind of an existential question, but how do we, push it down the stack, so to speak, of viable career options? It wasn't, literally, I was in my 30s before I even knew it was a possibility. So that's just kind of an existential thing. I want to talk about, there's kind of two frameworks that I think are worthwhile. And I've got a bunch of notes from the book we can dive into if we want to, but two things that I would love for you to talk about in terms of me and my customer, because I think anybody who's listening to this show later, especially, is probably, they want to know what are some very tangible things they could take away. And so in regards to me, I'd love for you to talk about the 5 Ps. And then in regards to my customer, I'd love for you to talk about it sucks that. Can we start with the 5 Ps? If you think about this, first and foremost being a self-discovery field guide, what are the 5 Ps and how does an individual use them to start to guide their exploration?
The 5 Ps are powers, passions, possessions, positions, and potentials. It took me a long time to figure out. But Nick wrote that chapter, so Nick, this is squarely in your account.
Is this like a behind the, is this inside the,
I hated that part to start with, and then I became kind of like the evangelist for it. So I went like full 180. I was like, this is dumb.
Style. Ron Johnson told me that he had a car ride with Steve Jobs, and he was talking about how they needed to reconfigure the entire kind of the organizing principle of the organization before the Apple Store came out. And he said Steve vehemently argued with him, was yelling at him in the car, berating him in the car, all that stuff. And then they get to the store and Steve verbatim says the thing that Ron said in the car as the new strategy. And Russian's like, wait, what?
I mean, Henrik and I have collaborated for 15 years now. So I think this is actually very interesting, if, as it were, as a quick aside, insight into what it is to collaborate with someone for a long time. I don't think it's specific necessarily to ours, although maybe it is. There's a funny thing when you know someone well enough to be able to trust them with your first draft, but you also know that the first draft's not always going to resonate, and sometimes it takes time, and sometimes sometimes I guess maybe the comment I'm going to make, because for people who are as communicate frequently as we do, and who I think communicate well, like I generally think that I can say things and Henrik hears what I'm saying, like, that I'm struggling to find words, but he can kind of like parse through what I'm saying. And I hope that roughly the same is true. But I swear that there are still times where you're saying something and the other side's not really picking up the other end of the line, like it's just, you're just saying it. And I'm not that like committed to ideas. I guess I don't think I am. I fashion myself as quite stubborn on a number of things, but ideas, for one, I'm very happy to like, if it comes out and people don't like it, I thought, all right, whatever. So like, I don't get emotional about it, and this was one that was actually just very practical, because we had this issue, which is like, we were kind of going along our own process of like, we'd already made this leap to say, hey, and it's kind of leads to your next question of like, if you're in the position of trying to come up with a business that you could start, if you're like, I want to start a company, I'm not really sure which one to start. I have an idea, but typically we would think that it might be not a bad idea for you to like stress test your own idea, even with some other versions of your own. Like what else could you work on, just so you have like a menu of options, put yourself in a little bit of a better position of leverage. Well, like we'd already made the step of saying, you certainly give yourself a big advantage to not be anchored in a solution. By the way, I did this. I spent 4 years of my life like starting a company where we basically started with the solution-ish, and we then kind of like had to kind of, riff around that. You just like limit your optionality a lot if you start with the solution. So the problem would be a better place. Just like the architecture of getting going benefits and is stronger and more resilient if you have like center the architecture around the problem you're trying to solve. But very quickly, you also realize, well, like, what if I got that part rusted? And like, what's my personal relationship to it? And why am I the right person to solve that problem? And you start asking a bunch of questions if you kind of abstract that, which at least one answer to is, well, like, do you give a shit, about like the person or group of people that you are trying to help? Do you have some insight into who they are? Do you speak their language? All these different things start to become the questions as to why you even pick that problem. And so that then became obviously a topic of like, who are you and who is your customer? And why are you even thinking about the problem to begin with? Why do you have any confidence that the problem is actually a real problem? And so it was kind of a natural, extension of going from solution to problem to kind of customer, that we had to end up in this debate about like, well, how do you even frame your own personal exposure to the question of like, who should you help?
You want to run through with them?
Well, largely we created these different frames of reference to try to think about like a way of like, understanding yourself. So we said powers, which I think is basically like, what are you good at? I worked on Wall Street. I happened to be okay at the time at like financial modeling. Well, like maybe one of my capabilities is financial modeling. So maybe I can like help other people who either want to become financial modelers or who are also financial modelers. I have credibility with them. And so maybe I can build product or service for them. So that would be like an existing of a power. Potential is kind of the opposite version of that. Is I'm going out of order, so I apologize. Henrik knows them better than I do at this point. Potential is like, what do you want to get better at? So what are you at least like intrinsically motivated to get better at? What are you studying? And if you are willing and able to study that, either and share your process, or once you arrive at the answer to how to get better at it, like you could share that with other people. That might be a good way to find other people to help, is like, who else wants to get better at that thing? And so that was another place where we felt you could kind of like look for founder customer fit. You could look for kind of relationship building opportunity. Positions is kind of probably the most traditional one, which is just like look at yourself and what roles you play in life, whether those be personal or professional, and try to anchor your point of view on the like who your sole customer is around that. So that's, I'm a dad, I'm a homeowner, I'm a dog parent. But like maybe importantly, when you think about like a dog parent, and Henrik obviously can talk to this much more, like there's often like a little bit of nuance in how you view the role if you've played it. It's like, I'm not a dog owner, I'm a dog parent. It's a specific flavor of this thing. I'm looking for other people who view themselves in that capability, in that role. So that's position. Possessions is also kind of obvious. Is another way of thinking about yourself, is like, what are the things you own and invest time, effort, and money in, and why, like if you're a hobbyist, boat owner, well, like that one way to think about who you are and who other people that might be your sole customers by what they kind of own or kind of curated into their like primary kind of collection of things to own. Maybe the other way of thinking about dog parents, the thing they own a dog and they have a sense of responsibility for this dog. And so maybe you can help other people who are like that.
Yeah, like in passions.
Passions. Yeah. So it's similar. I personally think that positions, possessions, and passions are kind of the obvious ones, and they all interrelate. They're all just different frames of reference on the same thing. Like, I'm a guitar player. I own a guitar. I'm passionate about learning guitar. Those are all, or whatever, like maybe those are all just different ways of thinking about the same thing. If you have a lineup across all of these, like I'm pretty good at the guitar. I am a guitarist, but I'm also really passionate about getting better at the guitar. Like, oh, those would be things that maybe you should really think hard about building something for other people who are, in the guitar category.
Well, I think just to make it, actionable for anyone to realize, okay, these are frames of reference that I can collide with my own kind of question of what could I start, right? Anybody who's talked to me for more than, one single session knows my second favorite quote about creativity is Arthur Kessler's, creativity is the collision of apparently unrelated frames of reference. And what you've done with the 5 Ps is you've given people unrelated frames of reference that they can collide with this question of what could I do? Where should I start? I feel like, by the way, this is imminently GPT-able, right? You can imagine a 5 Ps GPT, especially if somebody's got either custom instructions or history turned on. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if the GPT just could interrogate you and then know from what ChatGPT knows about you to make 5 recommendations based on what you already talked to me about. Here are your 5 Ps, 5 potential businesses that you could start, right?
And the other thing I'd add to that is I think it's also an interesting frame of reference when you are kind of evaluating one of your own ideas. And so very often I would imagine that people would not apply that framework kind of working forward from the framework.
It's a great
thing. Probably true about it sucks that stuff often too. And I think Henrik can probably talk more to this. I think, Henrik's ideas often come in the form of like, what if we did a thing that does X? And I think a lot of people, I do that, but I observed it in someone I spent a lot of time with. And, and even though I've spent so much time not being in solution mode, the idea's first version is often a solution. But baked into it, implicit in it is a problem statement, and is a founder customer fit, is an understanding of who the customer is and why they have the problem, and then the solution is what kind of gets articulated, and so sometimes these are also just useful frameworks for how do you take this thing that's nagging at you is in the back of your mind as an idea, like, hey, I'm only looking at this rain boot behind me. We should ship mom's rain boots on a subscription because the kids grow out of them too quickly and they only wear them once because it only rains once for every 6 months and they get too big. So what if we did that? That's a solution. But I already started to get at who's the customer and what their problem is and whatever. And so if you work backward, especially in the AI age, and you're going to have to be clear with people as to why you're doing this. Everyone's going to be able to make a copy of everything.
Why you are unique.
And why are you the person who's the best person to do that? It's going to become a big part of the logic. And so
that's
in the absence of having that, at least just extrapolated your own connection to it, I think you'll struggle. And so at least maybe if it's not something that you can move forward from, it is something that I think could be a framework for thinking about why am I interested in this?
Well, Nick, what you're doing is you're suggesting a second GPT. The first GPT is actually an idea generator. The other, a 5P based idea generator. The other GPT is a 5P based idea evaluator to give you frank and honest assessment of whether you are uniquely positioned to do the thing you're proposing based on your 5Ps.
Hey, Jeremy, what you then could do is you could take all the different tasks that an entrepreneur has to do to go from, I'd like to start something, but I don't know what to start, until having an actual business. You could string them together.
Imagine.
And you might call them autos.
Just because it would be automagical, is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay, what about it sucks that? So we talked about 5Ps and it being a great place for an individual to interrogate their own assets for where to start an entrepreneurial journey. Why is the next thing it sucks that?
It sucks that was something that we've been working with all the way through the pre-hype days when we wanted to start something new. And it was fed out of the insight that problems are better to find than ideas, because ideas are really just thesis statements against problems. And a problem is, it's difficult to just come up with a good idea from initially, but it's difficult to know if it's a good idea. It's easier to know if something is a real problem or a really felt problem because people are very good at articulating issues. And I think it started all the way back when, I was traveling around the world, and I would ask people, like sitting in the plane, I would ask like, hey, so, ever thought about a business idea? And people would clam out, like, and they'll give me their NDA, whatever, right? And then you say, oh, interesting, like what's a big business problem you're working on? Then people are like, how long time do you have? And they'll kind of like articulate all these different problems. And so we got obsessed about this kind of concept that if you could help people identify a real meaningful problem, then there's probably a good business somewhere at the end of that. If you started with the problem, not with the idea, then you had more shots on goal. Because if the first attempt of solving the problem with the first idea didn't work, then you can always go back and you wouldn't have wasted all the work and the access to the customer, all that stuff. Because then you might just kind of like attempt it, with something else. And thirdly, which kind of tied in with the 5 Ps, is that for many people, they don't realize until too late that they have to work on this thing for 10 years for it to be successful. And if you don't care about stuff, then it's a long time. And so what I have met in my career was people who like had this probably even fine business. They just kind of hated working at their own business because the customer that would call them every day were just people they didn't really give a shit about. And so a lot of these different things came together, and we got obsessed about, first, can you identify the problem? And then second, can you reframe it? And then can you test yourself into figuring out which one of the ideas is the best thesis against it? The underlying idea of it sucks is that it has to be something that requires a painkiller, not a vitamin pill. It needs to be something that people actually consider to be big enough for a problem to actually, react to it. So for example, if you show them an ad saying, don't you just hate when X, then it needed to be meaningful. And using like kind of like the loaded words of it sucks that instead of like, I find it to be an inconvenience when, then that kind of just intuitively got into that Matlab format. So that's the premise of it sucks that. We have it all the time. I even have it on my Post-it notes, right? We're now as an organization just trained in seeing, like when I hear people say something, my eyes light up now because I'm like, oh, business opportunities.
Mm. Since the 1960s, I think Bob McKim started doing this, but at Stanford, he would assign early design students who wanted to launch businesses. He would encourage them to keep bug lists, what he called bug lists, right? Which are lists of things that suck, you can say. You might have an it sucks that list, right? But what McKim knew, even in those very early days of the, long before the D school proper came around, was a problem is a necessary precondition to a solution. And if you want to be the kind of person who generates solutions, you have to be the kind of person who notices problems. And so it sucks that I think really it does a couple of things. One, it keys people in on, problems as kind of the anchor point. But then two, Henrik, to your point, the language itself really matters because it increases the likelihood of a worthy solution, right? And Nick, I'd love for you to say why, for the people who are prudish, who don't like this phrase, it sucks that, what's the case for preserving slightly offensive language here?
Yeah, well, for one, I was just in Bhutan and I was giving a lecture to a bunch of high school students and I was demoing autos and I got to the part where autos, as the first AI agent that you interact with when you're trying to start something with autos, does the it sucks that thing. And everyone starts giggling and I wasn't really paying attention. I was like, what's everyone giggling about? What are we laughing about? And they're like, they're all like pointing at the word. And it's kind of a jovial version of the point. I think it's visceral language. And I think that's what Henrik saying we're going for. You're trying to create a linguistic framework in which it just would feel wrong to fill in nice to have, like, it doesn't suck that, my coffee's not cold enough right now. Right? You were trying to create a bias towards filling in the blank with something on the margin, like just marginally more visceral, marginally more insightful, marginally more, noise cutting. And I think that's the case part. And by the way, there's all sorts of interesting, I think we actually have chatted about this before, but I'll just add, like, once you apply these frameworks, and one of the very interesting parts about having written a book at the same time as we were writing prompting. So roughly the same time we start writing this book is when we get access to GPT-3 and we start writing prompting. And so much of the book was written almost, I'm not going to say we were like super purposefully saying, oh, we're going to be able to load this book into a model and see what it says. But we were certainly, starting to become aware of like the prompting, or like telling AI how to talk, telling it what exercise to run, telling it what these things were going to be parts of our own ability to deliver our interests and expertise to other people. And so we certainly spent more time thinking about like, what words do we use? And so this is a place where we, with our agent, will, people will say, stop saying that. And the thing will say, it will try to explain why it's doing that. But I think visceral language is probably only more important in a world where like average language is, commoditized.
Right.
It's one of the only places where you can try to use some sentences, use some words that matter. So the role of it such that it's probably only become more important as we put some AI around our own tooling, because I think it's a way to express perspective. It's a way to kind of like, show what you believe to be true that maybe the average, answer doesn't otherwise deliver.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When average is easy, what you're always trying to do, you're effectively, and going back to Henrik's comment about everything is a prompt to an intelligent system, insofar as the book is a prompt to an intelligent human reading it, the elegance of it sucks that, which sounds paradoxical, but is not. The elegance is it influences the thinking of the intelligence differently than what's mildly inconvenient, right? And just like
with as few tokens as possible.
Exactly. With this perfectly said. Okay, I have two questions that I want to try to get to before we open it up to the audience. We'll see if we can or not. But one of the things that you addressed actually in the intro was, did AI write the book? And you talked about how, hey, we tried, and I'd love for you to just talk briefly about, not that you tried, I get that, and everybody gets that, but I would love for you, because you're such knowledgeable and thoughtful collaborators to AI. I know the fact that you tried means something. I'd love to know what you tried actually, why it failed, and whether you think that will continue to be the case in the future.
We basically tried to make it Airtable, like a database, and kind of like turn each row of the database into a paragraph, and to like almost write a script that would take whatever the immediately prior, like knew the outline of the book as we kind of understood it at that time, knew the chapter it was worth, like, if you imagine it's like every row of the Airtable is a piece of an outline. So we like pre-generate the outline. We could kind of like have like Roman numeral 1, section A, small Roman numeral 1, part 1, paragraph 1. And if we could just like, break it roughly down as much as possible, that maybe it could just like write the paragraph, or at least the next sentence. And so just tried to be very like, systematic about the manufacturing of the paragraph, knowing that we had a bunch of source material to at least have like helped inform both the outline and maybe fill in a bunch of the gap. I would observe that I think that would lead to a very like mechanical feeling. But if you even achieved it, and B, the context windows weren't as big, a year and a half ago as they are today. So maybe you have better luck today. But that was roughly a version of what we tried, was to use our own way of doing things, which is like, no job is too big once you've cut it into enough pieces, and to just try to slice the number of pieces so finely that you were asking AI to do something like really pretty straightforward. She's like, I just need a paragraph about X.
Right. In the context that I've already provided, knowing what you know is
knowing what you know, knowing where you are, like orienting you and knowing kind of the way it is, and then hope that maybe you get a little bit of like recursive kind of building as a backup out, because as you start to kind of build momentum, like it understands what to do next. Like almost using the fact that we created a source material to be like the introduction-ish, and maybe see where it would travel from there.
And why do you think it failed?
I think it failed at the time because I'm not sure that's how a book really gets written. Like you can't just like go forward from one sentence and see what the next sentence is. There's some degree of like planning involved with the overall arc. I also just think it got lost frequently. And lastly, I think the key thing that like took the essays that we already had, and so what we were really asking the AI to do and made them a book was the humanity of figuring out like, one, well, how do you make this like legible across the board? And two, what we were probably really shy on were case studies. And I think asking a GPT for a bunch of case studies is a pretty quick way to like end up with the first Google result of like, you know, whatever you would have otherwise searched for. So we were probably trying not to just deal with like, you want an example of that style of entrepreneurship? You need to look no further than, you know, Joe Schmo founded Coca-Cola. And you're like, oh, a personal relationship with the Coca-Cola case, then great, you know.
Okay. Last question. And then let's open the
Can you go, well, do we have time for, because Henrik said, you asked a bigger question.
Oh, yeah. Whether I need to
look forward. And I think that's, I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I'm curious on Henrik's answer to that.
I wonder, but please, Henrik, would love to hear.
I think we're getting close to AI being able to write a book, right? Like the question is not, can it write it? It's, can it write something that is meaningful to a human? And I think that is an area that we don't really have good terminology for yet of what's happening and why that may or may not happen. When I do something amazing with AI, I turn around to Nicholas and go like, look what I just got. You and the model just did. Like, oh, we just got to. What I don't do is I don't go to the model and go like, that was incredible what we just did. Like, let's just stop here for a moment and like talk about what you just did there, man. Right? Like I just don't have that response, right? And so I think that there is something interesting in the human in the loop, because I think that we have been trained for so many years as humans to connect to that. So I think for most of us, that will really matter. And I think you could have like AI writing thousands of books, but then I think a human would pick the one that is mostly interesting for their affinity group. And they'll say, you should look at what this, you know, you should read this book. And so, yes, the AI might have written the words, but it got its relevancies for humans because a human picked and kind of contextualized it. But you go into Juno and you write a song now, like there are good songs there that I could put on my playlist just fine. I don't think necessarily like I emotionally connected. Now, that being said, we obviously now increasingly are reading stories with people who get like deep emotional connection to their AI bots. So I think you will have a subsection of people that will, an AI will write a book and it'll resonate a lot with them. I think for the majority of people, for the foreseeable future, we need a human in the loop.
So my last question involves, you know, one thing that Seinfeld talked about is leaving on a high note. That's like a phrase that he used. Like they stopped the show when everybody wanted more, right? And that's kind of, I always think about that. I have to be honest with you. When I was on page 151, I'm just like a normal guy on an airplane reading a book. And I get to the section, what is it called? It's called, it says summing up. And, you know, and I'm summing up this chapter, of course. And I turn the page and it's, let's say, afterward. I was like, wait, it's over. Why stop there? Now, I'll preface this by saying there's so much more to be said about ideation, about prototyping, about testing. And by the way, there's still tons of pages after, call it the end of the book. So you won't fault me for thinking there was more, but why stop there?
I mean, like,
Done is better than perfect.
done is better than perfect. We ran out of time.
You just said that's it. We just got to ship the thing.
And I've ran out of time. I think we did. And we also, like, at that time, we started to rewrite the structure of the book a lot. And, you know, like, as Nick was saying, we're thinking about different flows of it. And so we did a bunch of different versions. And then we were like, and so I think, yeah.
We did talk a lot about writing a second edition of this book because of how much of a hypothesis the book was, right? That this is not a book that like attempts to tell you what we've observed as much as like attempts to lay out some points of view about where maybe the world is going. And so I think we got a decent amount of comfort for ourselves generally that this was like a first crack at a topic that we might come back to. So maybe what we were, without having thought through that, what you were experiencing, it was the feeling that we'd be better off getting it out having it like not waiting for a bunch of these case studies to start to appear, not waiting for it to be figured out how to prototype with AI, how to do these things, because A, they would become obsolete quickly, but B, we didn't really know yet. I mean, and so I at least personally, when I hear that, I was worried you're going to say the opposite thing, which is that you were like going and going and going. You're just like, man, this thing really ran out of steam. And so I guess I personally feel like that sounds great. If there are topics that you would love to hear about next, I would love to know what they are, and maybe you can share them. Maybe we can get the Fireflies note taker to send them what you just riffed off, because maybe that's the second edition.
Love it. Okay, so I want to, given the fact that so many folks have graciously given their time to be here live, I want to give folks a chance. If you have a question for the authors, would you like to come off mute and ask?
Well, someone nicely comes up. Oh, good, Simon. Thank you.
Please, Simon, please.
So many things you've said have made a lot of sense of the book, bizarrely, and even your last question, Jeremy, because I think for me, when I was listening to it, I love the framing of the 5 Ps. I thought that was it was a really lovely way of thinking about it, because the passion, purpose, and the ones that cluster together, that idea of the way you put the other two in, I thought, and very elegant, very elegant. But also, is this a story that hasn't yet really unfolded? And so it's perfect that you ended where you ended. And it's perfect that you just said what you just said about that, because, in a few years' time, we will know more. We are literally unfolding this. So I work with AI in software development, and actually Jeremy's asked me to talk next week about what I've been learning. And I've been thinking, okay, so what have I learned in software development, which is using agents to build software, and I'm not talking vibe coding, I'm talking big code-based software. What have I learned in there which could be applied elsewhere? And then I've got groups of people that I'm kind of learning with as well. And I think we're all learning in this process together. So I think it's really, really interesting that you ended where you ended. And I suppose, I don't know if I've got a question, but I just wanted to say that your book is one of those books that's left me wanting to read it again and think about it again deeply, because I think you've thought about, that's what comes across in the book, is you've thought about this stuff very deeply. And I now want to go and think about it deeply. I actually listened to the audiobook while I was driving down to a party over the weekend, and now reading the book. And it's actually really an interesting experience, seeing the words, hearing you speak the words, and now seeing them on the page, and I'm having a different visceral response. And as a Brit, I suppose, it sucks that, I'm like, I'm sorry. Let's use language like that. And it made me wonder why. Maybe there are less entrepreneurs in America.
The Brits and the Bhutanese, apparently. That's so.
I know, Henrik, I'm wondering what you think about that as a fellow, well, as speaking as an ex-European, but,
That's so good. That's so good. I have one question that somebody sent me. I mentioned to a community of mine that I was interviewing you guys, and I thought this was such a good question, and Nick has had a heads up, so he should have an answer for it. But I thought this was fabulous. Scott Walker says, you described the entrepreneur evolving from operator to orchestrator. What skills and daily practices do you think are most critical for founders to master in this new orchestration role?
I did have a heads up, and I found it to be a very interesting. Intuitive, very eloquent, because I think it's probing.
I think there's 3 things. I'll go because I have a short one, I think. And then I think there's 3 things that we keep going back to that we think are deeply entrepreneurial traits. And it's basically agitation. So making sure that you have a chip on your shoulder that makes you propel yourself forward, like have an agency. And that is something I think that you can teach yourself to have more of. I would say second, like having what we say gravity. I think somebody put it out about being storytellers. I think having the ability to tell a story about what problem you want to solve and why, it creates gravity. So it attracts people, customers, money, staff, collaborators. And then I think being resourceful. So have the ability of do a lot with a little. So And I think with AI tools, obviously that is something you can have much more of. And so those three things, practicing agitation, gravity, storytelling, and resourcefulness is probably the three kind of components I think is an evergreen entrepreneurial pedigree.
Can I add one, Henrik, just in the spirit of something I think you and I were discussing yesterday? And I have so many of these kinds of conversations, it's hard to remember, but I'm pretty sure you and I were talking about it. But this idea of parallelizing workflows right now. So, historically, if you've wanted to build a prototype, the D School will tell people to use popsicle sticks and construction paper, and that's great. But then if you say now do it again, like say it takes me 10 minutes, do it again. I now have to take I have to manually use the scissors and do it again, right? Increasingly with tools like say Replit, for example, you can create a higher resolution, and there's dangers to that as we discussed, but you can create a higher resolution prototype than you can create with your hands with construction paper. And now I would just say that the habit, Henrik, to build on your three, a habit that I might recommend to Scott's question is do three, because these are non-deterministic models. You can take your same prompt to one Replit window, run it 3 times. You're going to get 3 different prototypes. And because they're non-deterministic, they're all going to be slightly weirder and different in ways that you can't imagine. And it doesn't take, unlike the construction paper second one that takes another 10 minutes and the third one takes another 10 minutes, you can literally deploy them at the same time. And then you're kind of toggling. Actually, the word that was coming to my mind when you were saying agitate and those other great words was toggle. And orchestration, I think of a conductor, they're attending to the flutes and then they're attending to the whatever, right? And orchestration implies there's multiple things I'm attending to. And if there's not a multiple, you should just have that multiple mindset, right? Why not do 3? If it's a prototype, great. If it's a problem statement, great. Whatever it is, like a multiple kind of mindset, I think is very important.
Yeah, there's something I was struggling to kind of come up with words for a bit, but I appreciate you did, because the question really compares this. I guess we wrote it like this comparison or this contrast of the orchestrator versus operator. And I was having a hard time. I'm like, what do we really mean by that? I think you've hit a lot on what probably we mean by it, which is operator implies something quite linear. And I think probably we're headed towards a world where, if it is linear, it is linear in massively parallelized form, if not to the point, therefore, much more kind of networked, much more, kind of multi and one-to-many in its kind of appearance. And so I think that's probably a lot of what we see. Although I think probably the primary point we were kind of made there was just back to Henrik's point of like everything is a prompt to an intelligent system. If you imagine yourself that way, well, then like how do you behave? And one of them might be that the cost of getting that intelligent system to do something is getting lower and lower and lower. So
I think this is kind of fascinating. I now feel like it's a waste of agent credits if I don't prompt an agent to do something before I go to bed. Because why not, right? Like I'm traveling right now, working with an organization. And late at night, this, kind of big time leader asked me a really thorny question. And either, my subconscious, can work on it while I sleep. Why would I not deploy an agent to make progress, right? And I woke up this morning, ChatGPT agent had spent 48 minutes creating a 1,000-word executive summary, a 10-page slide deck, and a CSV, like multiple CSVs of research in a data room. Why would I not, like that? To me, it's like an example of orchestration. Before you go to bed, get an agent to do something.
I think we should let people who's kind enough to give us an hour, let them go here on top of the hour. So, Jeremy,
do you want to wrap the podcast episode, Henrik?
I want to wrap the podcast episode.
If you've enjoyed this episode,
and like Jeremy said, so taggy. No, but I do want to say thank you to everybody who showed up on this specific call, because they were kind enough to pre-buy the book. It does mean a lot to us, and so thank you so much. If you have one extra ask, it is to go and review the book on Amazon, which obviously be, massive for us. But, we took a lot of time and it sounds like a few of you really enjoyed it. And so thank you so much for both reading the book and for showing up. And of course, to Jeremy, who was our dear friend, but also such a good thought partner. And so thank you also for spending time with us and kind of, as always, make us sound a little bit smarter along the way. So I think with that, thank you, everybody. And then goodbye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy.
My pleasure.